What's up, everybody? Michael Walsh here. So I've got an interesting topic video today, and it's in response to someone who left a comment on the Dominic Cruz video I made last week, where I was, addressing whether or not Cruz is correct or not, that referees should let the fights go longer than they currently do. And in that video, I told an anecdote about my last fight, where I got my opponent in a really tight heel hook. He screamed out loud, and I recognized that scream to be a verbal tap. So as soon as he screamed, I let go. And in the moment, I was worried because it instantly occurred to me that oh shit, I've let go, but the ref didn't officially stop the fight. The fight might continue. And I looked at the ref and I said that was a tap, and the ref said, yeah, I know, and stopped it right after that. So it all worked out well. But this guy left a really nice comment and said nice things about the video, but he asked me though, should the scream actually count as a tap? Because he made the argument that it is a fight, right? And painful shit happens during a fight. Someone might scream because of something that's happening to them, but that doesn't necessarily mean they want the fight to be stopped, that they are tapping out, or that the fight should be stopped on their behalf by the referee. So should a scream count as a verbal tap? And I thought that was an interesting question, and I want this to be a comprehensive video where I kind of discuss not only that and my suspicion for why that is considered a tap in the first place, but the very topic of verbal taps, and basically the topic of submissions that don't end in the typical way with someone tapping out. So technical submissions, guys getting choked out, limbs breaking, et cetera, and fights where people do scream and the fight continues. So I want to tackle this from all angles here, but as I think it's an interesting topic. But starting at the beginning, why is a scream considered a tap? And maybe we should actually start by saying what is a verbal tap? So if you are in a submission hold, the standard etiquette and the standard expectation is that you're being choked unconscious or your limb is being taken to a breaking point. And before you're choked unconscious, or before that limb actually breaks, or that joint gets damaged, whatever it is, before that happens, you say, okay, I recognize I can't get out of this. I recognize I'm going to get hurt or choked out. So rather than have that happen, I will surrender. I will give up. I will yield. And the way I will demonstrate that in the universal language to my partner is to physically tap out. And that can take many forms. You can tap yourself. You can tap them. You can tap the floor. Sometimes you tap with your feet. Sometimes your hands, imagine someone has a choke around your neck and you're trying to peel their arm off. Sometimes your fingers kind of get stuck and your fingers are aiding in the choke. They're crushed up against your throat and they're kind of being pinned by the arm that's wrapped around your neck. And you're gurgling and you need to tap, and you'll tap with your feet. That happens. Guys who train jiu-jitsu will have no doubt probably done that themselves and definitely seen that happen. But that's the conventional tap. It's a physical tap that signifies you give up. Now, you can verbally tap, and the most obvious way to do that, the most kind of standard equivalent way to the physical tap, would be to just say tap, or say I tap, I tap out, whatever. That's just that's the equivalent. That's just another form of communication, but that's the same as physically tapping. And it's kind of like Fight Club. If you remember the scene where Brad Pitt is giving the initiation speech to the newcomers before they have their first fight of the night or whatever, he says to them, he's laying out the rules, and he says something like, if an opponent goes out, goes limp, scream stop, the fight is over. Screaming stop in that case is the equivalent to saying I tap, and interestingly, in that context, he's probably not even thinking so much about submissions as he is about strikes. So he's probably thinking about a scenario where one guy's on top just pummeling the other guy, and the guy on the bottom screams out, stop. And that can happen in MMA. You can submit to strikes. If you look at someone's record and it says loss, submission due to strikes, that's what happened. They were getting beaten up with strikes, and rather than go unconscious or get, or not defend themselves to a point where the ref calls it and rules it a TKO, instead of those things happening, they literally tap out. They say, I give up because of the strikes. I'm pretty sure that's how GSP lost to Matt Serra. I believe it was a submission to strikes and not a TKO. But that's how that can happen. So a scream is considered the equivalent to saying, I tap. Why is that? I don't know 100% the history of the rules and what the what the closed room like rationale was at those meetings where they were laying out the rules, but I suspect it comes from training. So if you've ever done submission grappling, if you've done Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, judo, whatever, any sort of submission martial art or combat sport where you're sparring with opponents and applying submission holds, the etiquette is overwhelmingly such that you are expected to treat a scream as a tap. So just imagine it. Like if you were at a jiu-jitsu gym and you're sparring with someone and you put them in an arm lock or a leg lock, whatever, and they scream out loud, but you keep cranking it and just like wrench their shit, like you can imagine that the coach would be really mad. The coach would come up to you after and say, dude, why didn't you let go? The fucking guy was screaming. And if you said to the coach, yeah, but you didn't tap, like you're going to get kicked the fuck out of there. Like that's just wildly unacceptable. And I'm sure the guy who left the comment would recognize that. You know, and the question is like, yeah, but that's sparring. Should that also apply to a fight? And I think there's arguments in both directions. But I just say all that to mean I'd wager that's why in the rules it actually says that counts. That like a scream counts as a verbal tap. I suspect is because of the training culture and etiquette. But should it count though? I think the best argument for why it should is because it is actually rare for someone to scream in a fight. Because the guy who left the comment said, like, look, you know, it's a fight, painful shit happens, someone might scream. It is pretty rare for someone to scream in a fight because the reality is fighters, you know, we're tough people, we're used to this shit, we're used to getting hit, we're used to having our stuff cranked on, we're used to being uncomfortable. You know, people don't usually scream in the training room, again, unless they're like actually about to have their limbs snapped in half. And in an actual competition, it's all the less common to scream because the adrenaline really numbs you to the pain. So, and this is my own kind of like self-reflective rationale here, but if someone screams during a fight, especially if they're obviously in some sort of submission hold, that probably means they're desperate. That probably means that psychologically they feel it go on really quick. They know their body is about to be broken. And they've switched from fight mode to a desperate, afraid mode where they recognize the urgency of the situation. And they're so distressed that it's actually like, it's not only overriding their toughness and their competitiveness and their like desire to not seem like a bitch, but it's even overriding their rational faculties because rationally they should know like, oh shit, I should tap, like that's on. But they're so afraid, they're so like, oh fuck, because they, you know, because sometimes it happens. Like sometimes it's very inconsistent, but like you can be in a situation where something feels tight and you know like shit, that's like near breaking, but fuck it, like I think I can get out. The same guy can feel that way in one situation, but in another situation be like, you like just feel it go on so quick and in such a way that's so obviously about to hurt you that again, it just blows past all that. It blows past your ego, your machismo, your bravado, your rational mind, and it just puts you into desperate, like terrified mode because you know you're about to be hurt. And that happens. And so again, if someone screams during a fight in a submission hold, I'd be inclined to assume that's what happened. They've entered a state of self-preservation that's so emotional that they're not even like, they don't even have the presence of mind to know they should tap. They're just screaming. So since that's probably what happens or what is happening in a situation like that, I do think it makes sense for the ref to call it. And I think it makes sense to make that the rule and just the agreed upon thing. And like, and so you know then as the competitor, if you don't want that to happen, then just don't fucking scream. Like, you know, there's a sort of expectation where it's like, yeah, okay, well, you know, tough it up then. Don't fucking scream if you don't want us to call it. You know, I think that's a reasonable onus to put on the fighter. However, there are exceptions to this because I can think of fights where guys have screamed and they clearly weren't tapping. So the best example by far, I think, is Kevin Randleman versus Shogun Rua. So the fight ultimately ends with Shogun getting Randleman in a knee bar and Randleman taps out. However, before that, there's this prolonged exchange of like footsie where their legs are entangled and Shogun keeps cycling through like toe hold attempts and knee bar attempts and whatnot. And the toe hold attempts are really tight. He's just like wrenching on Randleman. And Randleman is trying to gut it out. You know, he's trying to stay in the fight, but he's clearly getting his shit all tore up. And he literally is screaming at points. He's just like, ah, you know, he's screaming out loud at points. And the ref doesn't call it, and that's in large part because it's pride. You know, so it's, you know, they were all a little harder in Japan, you know, with that stuff, especially back then. But he screams a lot in that fight, and, you know, it's not called off and then until he taps. And in that case, I was okay with it because it was clear that he was trying to keep fighting. He was just screaming because it hurt, and it hurt enough to make him scream. You know, it just is what it is. It supports the kind of argument the guy who left the comment was making. And this stuff does get murky because, like, think to Merab's fight with Peter Yan the other week. I think it was, I was listening to the 6-round post-fight show, and Eddie, the co-host on there, was making a joke about when Merab like would scream and shout after those body shots, you know, which was obviously just him being expressive, and I think him kind of hyping himself up a little bit. Sometimes you can, you know, I think that was kind of like, remember the scene in Dark Knight Rises when Batman is getting like the shit kicked out of him by Bane in the first fight? And there's that point where he's like on the little bridge thing and Bane is walking up to him and Batman's just like, ah! Like, I think that was kind of that response from Merab, where he's sort of trying to amp himself up a little bit to like gut through this painful moment. But anyways, I bring it all up because Eddie joked that him screaming and shouting in response to the body kick was a verbal tap. And he said right away, like, he's just joking. You know, he's making a joke. He's not actually saying the fight should have been stopped from that. But, you know, kind of per the letter of the law, like, you could make an argument that if you scream after getting kicked in the body, that is a verbal tap. And if it's not then why should it be with a submission hold? You know, you could make that argument. And on top of that, there are guys who are clearly getting hurt and are just gritting through it, and we typically don't call those. So, like, I mean, I'm going to have a lot of examples of, like, Gracie fights as we go on through this video, but the first one is Royce Gracie versus Matt Hughes. So, Royce was old, he had no business being in there with Hughes, and Hughes kicked his ass, and Hughes was a wrestler who had learned some submissions, and he was a good submission threat. I mean, the guy submitted Ricardo Almeida, for Christ's sake, but, like, there was a lot of talk going in, and Royce, you know, a lot of shit talking about whether Hughes could submit Royce, and yada yada, and Hughes, the fight starts, and Hughes is just mauling him. And at some point, Hughes gets on top, and he puts him in a straight arm lock with the arm. So instead of a Kimura, the straight arm lock. It's the submission that Tom Aspinall got Volkov in. So Hughes has one of those on Royce. And Royce, you can see, is like getting hurt. You can see his elbow is starting to hyperextend. You can see it's breaking that parallel plane, or that 180 degree plane, and going into, you know, greater than 180 degree angle. And you can just see that it hurts because Royce is like literally just kind of closing his eyes and grimacing. You can see he's just like going to a happy place to try to just get through this without tapping, because he doesn't want to dishonor himself and his family in Gracie Jiu-Jitsu by tapping out to this fucking wrestler. So he's clearly willing to take damage rather than tap. And that was a theme for the Gracies. And due to the nature of like how the hold was applied and the fact that like the arm was going along the floor, so like the wrist was hitting the floor, so he just kind of couldn't take it any further than he was taking it, he was eventually let go because Royce went and tapped, and then he just started beating the shit out of him and got a TKO win instead. So that's what happened there. But should that have been called? You know, like, he didn't tap, he didn't verbally tap, he didn't scream. But should you look at that and be like, dude, I can tell your joint is being wrenched, injury appears imminent, or like it might have already happened, and you're grimacing in a way that is like the facial equivalent to screaming. So, like, you know, the ref could make a similar argument, like, well, if you just screamed, I would call it. So should I call it now? And, you know, you could make that argument. Personally, you know, you'll kind of get my overall take when the video wraps up here, but like, personally, I wouldn't call it there, but I could see the argument, you know? And it makes me think of another Gracie fight with my man Sakuraba when he fought, I believe it was Royler Gracie, and it's in Pride, and he puts him in a Kimura, and Royler is not injured, like the arm doesn't snap or anything, and he doesn't tap out, but the ref calls it because he's clearly stuck in the Kimura. It's being applied and applied and wrenched and wrenched and wrenched, like further and further, and Royler can't really get out, and it looks like, you know, it's entering into like extreme ranges of motion where you could reasonably wonder, like, is it already damaged? Because, like, look how fucking far he's wrenching it. And the ref calls it. And it was argued to be an early stoppage because he didn't tap, and it was argued that he wasn't injured yet. But it was sort of in that murky area of like, yeah, but this is clearly on. He's clearly just going to keep taking it further and further. It's already gone, like, past a point it would on a normal person anyways. You clearly aren't doing anything to get out. Should the ref call it and just save your fucking arm? You know, you can make that argument. It's sort of like the Mike Chiesa Kevin Lee fight, where, and I just rewatched that to kind of make sure I remembered it correctly, but like, that one's a little weird because Chiesa puts a choke on, and the fight is called early, and Michael Chiesa does not tap out, and he does not go out. And you could say, well, I could see stopping it early for a joint lock because an injury can happen. But if it's a chokehold, the worst thing that'll happen is the guy will go out. So you should never call it early then. Now, I think what happened there, and because I would agree with that ordinarily, because being choked out doesn't seem to be, you know, it's not like getting knocked out as far as like brain damage or anything. And it's not like it's not like something's going to break if you get choked out for a second. Like, I've been choked out. You just wake up like nothing happens. You know? But in any case, that fight, though, I believe was stopped for one of two reasons. Either because I rewatched it, Chiesa is fighting the hold, he's fighting the grip, and then he lets go, and he kind of looks like his facial expression is such like he's starting to go out, and his hands do this weird like limp thing like this. And I think the ref either saw his wrists do this and thought he was out and called it for that reason, or he thought that this was a tap. Because if you think of it, there's like an arm around his neck, and his wrist kind of does this. And it's just his wrist going limp, and it's like right next to the arm. But I could see the ref being like, oh, he was fighting the grip, he let go, and like this happened, that was a tap. And the ref just like misinterpreted the physical motion. But in any case, I don't think I think the ref was mistaken because I don't think that was a tap, and I don't think he went out. I think he was about to go out. But in either case, I think the ref made the wrong call, but I can see why the ref made it. I can see why the ref would interpret that as either being him going limp and going out, or him tapping because he did this to his fucking arm. But a kind of more egregious one, and maybe kind of more memorable one for a lot of people, would be Robbie Lawler versus Ben Askren. You know, Lawler is kind of beating the shit out of Askren, but Askren survives, and he puts him in this bulldog choke that's over the chin, and there's this fucking weird moment where he's got Lawler like this, and Lawler has his like hand up on Askren's arm, and then his hand just goes like that. And it appears to have been just a weird in-the-moment choice from Lawler, because he was just, he just didn't feel like this was doing anything, and he's trying to like grit out this choke. But Herb Dean famously like goes to like grab his arm to see if it's limp, and immediately stops the fight. Lawler was not out, leading you to assume that checking the arm was largely performative on Herb's part, and in his head he's just like, oh fuck, he's out. And so people thought that was an early stoppage. They thought it was bullshit. Well, this isn't a habit I'm trying to get into. We've got back-to-back videos here of having 2 takes, so the fucking memory card was full again. So, you know, people thought that stoppage was early. They thought that, you know, Lawler wasn't out. And yeah, Herb, I do think, made the error of like, he'd basically made the choice in the moment to call the fight, and I do think him checking the arm was largely performative. But I saw an interesting interview with him. I think it was on Joe Rogan after the fact, but he said kind of why he did that. And his rationale was interesting. He thought that if someone goes limp in certain chokeholds, it's very dangerous because now the spine can get wrenched. So like you imagine like a headlock like that, there is twisting action happening on the head. And if they go limp, they're no longer bracing and resisting. Like the spine can just be twisted and wrenched on as much as they want. and he compared it to some like regional fight he reffed where one guy's on the other dude's back, and instead of putting him in a rear naked choke, he does like a reverse guillotine where you wrap around the neck and like break their neck. It's a neck breaker move. And if you guys remember when Arman just fought Dan Hooker, people pointed out that when Arman spins out of that guillotine into guard, there's a brief moment where his back is to Hooker, and he's putting himself at risk of that exact same neck breaker move. He just successfully alligator rolled out of it, so it wasn't an issue. But that is a real move, and like even like the Japanese jiu-jitsu system I did, because I do Japanese jiu-jitsu and Brazilian jiu-jitsu, but like the Japanese system I do, like that's like a move where we were taught like as like a self-defense move where someone steps in to throw you, so picture like an arm throw, you block the hip, you like palm strike their tailbone basically to stop their hip, and now their back is to you, you then wrap the neck, take them back and crank. And yeah, it's a neck breaker. So I can see where Herb Dean was worried, like, oh shit, he's gone out. His neck is now in this deeply vulnerable position because he's being headlocked. I need to stop this fight. So I get all that. Circling back to like the Gracies, the thumbnail for this video and my profile pic is literally a picture of Sakuraba taking on Renzo Gracie and famously breaking his arm with a Kimura. Now, Renzo doesn't tap. It's the same thing that happened between Frank Mir and Nogueira, same like break and everything, same submission. But Renzo does not tap, but nevertheless, the ref calls it. The ref says, like, look, your arm is broken. We're going to call this. It's a technical submission. And some people have argued that you shouldn't call fights in that situation. Like, I've seen MMA Guru argue that, where it's like, dude, the break has already happened. The fighter has already said, I'm willing to fight through this and accept the injury. By calling it afterwards, it's the worst of both worlds. They've broken it for nothing, And I see that argument, but on the flip side, I see the argument that certain submissions, like it can get worse. If you're not tapping and it's already damaged, but they just keep, it's like, especially for like heel hooks and stuff, like if I have an inverted heel hook on someone and their knee starts ripping apart and they don't tap, the damage is not over. I'm going to keep cranking, and more shit will rip more and more thoroughly until they just have a loose, fucking, like Monty Python limb hanging from their fucking thigh, so like that's a reason to call it. And we also recognize on like a sporting level that realistically, if your shit is that broken, you just can't win. That's why most of us don't consider Aljamain Sterling's win over TJ Dillashaw to be very legitimate. We see that fight as being basically basically a bullshit fight that shouldn't have happened, because TJ entering the fight effectively with one arm meant he had virtually no shot of winning. And that's when he was fresh and everything. So like that's the same rationale. Like that's why we say like, well, your fucking like shin snapped in half, your fucking knee exploded, your fucking arm snapped in two, whatever it is, you can't fight anymore. You can't beat this dude. Like you're too fucked up. Like we're calling it. Like this is this isn't life or death, So that's the argument there for like technical submissions and why they happen. And how this all connects to the broader topic is like, where is the point where you call it? Because again, you can have a case where someone is screaming, but they are clearly still in the fight and trying to win and trying to survive, like Randleman was against Shogun. And you can have people who aren't screaming, but might as well be, like when Royce is getting arm locked by Matt Hughes and he's just gritting down and like just sucking it up. Like that might as well be screaming. And if we're going to count a scream as a tap, we might as well count that as a fucking tap. And then conversely, like sometimes it just does break and they don't tap and we call it a technical submission. And sometimes we don't. So like sometimes shit breaks and sometimes shit gets hurt. Maybe it doesn't break, but damage is done, but the fight continues. And sometimes it's from strikes, but sometimes it's not. So like, we've seen that a million times where someone's arm breaks during a fight because they block a kick, or someone's hand breaks from punching, and the fight goes the distance. Even if we have reason to think that they're injured, you can see that their forearm is ballooning up or whatever. We can see they're not throwing the hand or whatever. and the fight continues. Sometimes the corners stop it in between fights, like when Holland fought Thompson, or when Pettis fought Ferguson. Sometimes that happens, but often it goes the distance. Or just look at Robert Whittaker. His knee gets all fucked up from Yoel Romero in, I think, the first fight, where Romero's throwing the oblique kicks and the side kicks at the knee, the stomps. Like, he fucked Whittaker's knee up, but the fight went the distance, even though it was an injury. Or just look at a submission context. Corey Sandhagen fucked up Figueiredo's knee in all those leg exchanges, and that ended the fight, but he did the same thing to Dillashaw, and that fight went 5 rounds. Dillashaw's knee got janked up by Sandhagen going for leg locks. He didn't tap, and the ref didn't call it. It wasn't ruled a technical submission. It wasn't ruled, it wasn't said like, oh, you've been injured by the submission attempt. We're just calling the fight on your behalf. They just let it go. And Dillashaw won, controversially, but he won, So it's like, it's difficult to know what to do. It's hard to make one rule that works in every case because, again, I think there's times where someone screams and it's obvious that they're like screaming out of desperate fear, in which case I think the fight should be stopped. And I would say the example I told, my anecdote of like my last fight was that. I think the guy screamed in, oh, fuck, my knee is like exploding kind of fear. And after the fact, he wasn't mad about it at all. He actually thanked me for letting go after the fact when we ran into each other. But in other cases, again, like Royce Gracie, Kevin Randleman, whatever, the guy is still able to fight. And in some cases, guys are able to win with injuries. Dillashaw is both sides of that coin. We recognize that his arm was so compromised in the Sterling fight that he really had no chance. But on the flip side, he beat Sandhagen with a fucked up knee for like 4 out of the 5 rounds. So, it's tricky. And as a total aside, but a thing that annoys me, I've said many times in this video the term technical submission. Not to go on like a George Carlin-esque rant here, but I think the terms technical submission and technical knockout are both weird and kind of dumb, like grammatically, because they should be called like practical submissions or practical knockouts, or effective submissions or effective knockouts. They shouldn't be called technical submissions and technical knockouts, because technically the guy did not submit and technically the guy is not knocked out, right? Because, it's the opposite. Like, take a TKO. It's like, technically this guy is not knocked out. Technically he is still conscious. If he were unconscious, we would call it a KO. He is conscious, so we're calling it a so we're ending the fight, but like, technically he's not knocked out. He's effectively knocked out. He's practically knocked out. He might as well be knocked out. He's about to be actually knocked out. But he's not technically knocked out. Technically, he's fucking awake. Like, it should be called an effective knockout or a practical knockout. And same with the submissions. It's like, take the Renzo Gracie one where his arm snaps, but he doesn't tap out and the ref calls it. Technically, he did not submit. Technically, this is not a submission. It's practically a submission. It's effectively a submission. The guy's fucking arm snapped in half. Like, we're going to call the fight. But technically, he did not submit. So, again, in a George Carlin way of when he complains about like getting, when people talk about like getting on the plane, it's like, fuck you, I'm getting in the plane. Let Evel Knievel get on the plane. Like, same way that annoys me. Like, it shouldn't be called a technical knockout or technical submission. But in any case, to the broader topic of the video, I think, again, there's no good one size fits all, because sometimes it's clear they are giving up or that they need saving, and sometimes it's clear that they don't. And after they've been injured, sometimes it's clear they can't fight on, and sometimes they kind of fight it's barely noticeable that they're injured. So there's no good one rule to make. I think you kind of need to leave it to referee discretion. And my own bias is that I am okay with letting it go more often than not, because like I said in the Dominic Cruz video, I sort of have a bias more towards letting fights go longer when it comes to TKOs rather than calling them early, even though I see both sides. I am a little more libertarian, as time goes on with this kind of stuff, where it's like, well, hey, I mean, you can tap to the strikes if you're getting too fucked up. Your corner can throw the towel in if you're getting too fucked up. Like, why do you need the ref to like save you and be your nanny? It's kind of similar with submissions. It's like you can just actually tap. But the difference there is, again, the scream psychologically might actually mean they're so distressed they aren't tapping, which I think is the difference. Because, with a TKO, it's like, you're just not going to scream. Yeah, we brought up the Marab example in the Fight Club idea, but like, people just don't scream in MMA fights from being pummeled with punches. And you're either like out, in which case the fight should be stopped, you are unconscious, or you're not out, in which case you can tap and give up and your corner can throw in the towel. So it's like there's time for all those things. Whereas, again, with the submission, like if you scream, you may like want to tap. You're just too distressed. So I think that's worth noting, and I think the ref needs to just diagnose that on the spot, basically. And that puts more pressure on the ref, and that means more fuck-ups. But nevertheless, I think that's the only way you can do it, because sometimes guys are gritting through and they're willing to take a little damage, and the fight should continue because these guys are fucking warriors, and the ref needs to be able to recognize that and know the fighters and all that kind of stuff. But in other cases, the guy is screaming in desperation and the fight needs to be fucking stopped. And you can't just say like, well, you didn't tap yet, and just let the guy's knee explode. I don't think that's right either. So, bit of a long-winded video, but, I thought it was an interesting topic, and I wanted to give that guy who left the comment, a proper follow-up. And I figure, it's the day after Christmas, there ain't a lot of fucking MMA content out at the moment, so long video it was. So that's all I got.